Welcome to the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Science for the next speaker in the seminar series, Dr. Iain Davidson-Hunt. Iain is a graduate in crop science from the University of Guelph. He received his master's in resource management and an interdisciplinary PhD at the University of Manitoba. And he's been with the Natural Resource Institute and the Clayton Riddell Faculty of Earth, Environment and Resources since 2003. He's also a registered professional planner with the Canadian Institute of Planners. Iain's main research focus is on biocultural design as a practice to support innovation for small-scale food systems. And this is particularly associated with territorial development, and the work is generally undertaken in partnership with indigenous peoples and local communities in rural and remote regions of various parts of the Americas. He's worked with indigenous peoples and local communities on territorial land use planning, ethnoecology, ethnobotany, and biodiversity-based enterprise development. Iain is also the incoming chair of the Food Systems Research Group. It's a new research group that's been implemented at the University of Manitoba, looking at cross-disciplinary linkages in food systems in the Faculty of Arts, Faculty of the Environment, Faculty of Agriculture, and also the Faculty of Science. So please give a warm welcome to Iain Davidson-Hunt.
Thank you, Martin, for the invitation to speak, and for those who have organized the session, as well as those of you who made the time to attend. I know myself there's many good talks on campus, and so little time that I do appreciate it when you get this many people out. Not quite more than what I would have expected. However, I will do my best. I was sort of told, so I got to make sure I have this right. I was told the talks here are 50 minutes with 10 minutes questions. I have tried to make it less than that. However, we shall see. And at a talk of that length, I'm pretty much going to follow a script, which isn't how I would usually do things, so it's a little bit different than how I would normally do it. But I think if I don't, I have so many rabbit holes on potential slides that if I don't stay to script and I start pursuing some avenues that open up in some of them, we could be here longer than we want to be. Let me just get started. Okay, so a little bit about myself. I was just trying to think if I wanted to put out any other caveats too. Oh yeah, I had one other caveat. I probably haven't practiced this as much as I've told my students they should practice. So I'm hoping my timings on the slides work. And for those of my students who are here, this may become an example of what you should try and avoid. So I like to teach through doing, but we'll try and avoid that. We'll try and make it a good example. Okay, so as Martin said, I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and Crop Science in Guelph, but then spent in 1988, and then spent the next 5 years in Bolivia and Mexico working with the Mennonite Central Committee. Largely with indigenous farmers, and some of whom had actually moved from the highlands in Bolivia down into the Amazon. Then I returned and did my Master's of Natural Resource Management, and I worked with someone who some of you may be familiar with, some from the NRI are definitely familiar. It's Dr. Fikret Berke. So at that time period in 1993, Fikret was about the only person doing indigenous knowledge systems. Outside of a guy at Washington, and another one, Robert Rhodes, who had recently returned from the center, the International Potato Center, who was at Georgia at the time. So having an interest, having spent that much time in peasant agricultural systems, and wanting to really work with those knowledge systems, there was very little options. And so that's how I ended up here. And then left that and opened up a nonprofit organization in Northwestern Ontario, and then spent the next 6 years working with First Nations on land use planning and community-based enterprises. And that's sort of where I got my planning certification. And at that time, somehow undertook and finished a PhD, which was really focused on ethnobotany, because at that time I wanted to sort of bring together the botany that I'd sort of drawn forward from my undergrad, and anthropology, which I had dabbled in but hadn't really spent enough time with. So that's sort of going to give you a sense of where this presentation is going to come from on food systems. So, without doubt, I bring a particular perspective. It's transdisciplinary, meaning I bring together knowledge from various disciplines and knowledge systems and considered applied problems in relation to food systems from a positionality rooted in remote and rural communities. So if you want to think about it, I really start there and then look outwards to how these systems develop and how they link up. So what I'm going to present today is rooted in this experience, and it's really been an intention to try and develop a consistent framing and a practice that allows us to support these community enterprises or enterprises in these rural and remote regions that can benefit and provide local benefits from their existing resources. We sort of organize this with what we call biocultural design workshops. And I say we in this case because I need to recognize that, of course, like in most of us, these work comes, for us, a workshop maybe is like your lab. We sort of use it intentionally, and I won't get into that. But it's the work we do with our graduate students and our partners. And so this is really the result of a collaborative construction of knowledge and practice. Most of that work's been in Canada, mostly northwestern Ontario, some in northern Manitoba, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Bolivia, with sort of some work starting up in Mexico. Okay, moving on. And let me start my timer, because I'm already behind. Okay. So, this is what I'm going to call this talk today is organized as a talk of 3 parts. These parts are interrelated, but they are distinct. And what I would say is they move from I'm going to preface this with a short comment on the Food System Research Group, just because that's one of the reasons I'm here today and probably why I got the invitation, because I don't usually get to this side of the campus, but I am involved in this group. And since Martin dragged me into it, no, Mark invited me to be part of that, and we've worked together. I think I should at least comment on it. The second part is sort of the core part. It'll be the most extended. It will probably lose you at points conceptually, and I will try and bring that back and ground it in some practical sort of examples. And then I'm going to finish with what is called 1 there, which should have been 3, with the most tenuous part, the most recent re-engagements back for me into a prairie food system. And as I say, that part's really going to be somewhat brief and is really early days for us in that work. Okay, just a complicated slide, but just to try and make a few different points, and maybe to save a bit of time, I'll just sort of abridge this a little bit. For those of you, some of you may have been involved in that workshop in 2015. It was a workshop on the Sustainable Food System Workshop. Had huge participation, 84 different people. And it led to a report. This was the cover of it. And there was, the sort of goal was to advance this really excellently named core research theme, safe, healthy, just, and sustainable food systems. And it recommended that we strengthen connections on campus and that we undertake a planning conversation. I like that term. It was sort of like, wow. Okay, so we did that. And that happened over 2016 and 2017. So the typical glacial speed of university committees. We finally submitted a report in the fall of 2017, or a proposal in 2017. And that is a little different, I think, for those people and faculty members who think of research groups and often think of those led by a single sort of research lead. And I think because this is trying to strengthen connections, get this conversation going across faculties, it was submitted by 4 different representatives of 4 different faculties with advisory roles for the Associate Dean's Research, because it's really a process of us trying to figure out how we're going to scope and define this research area. So that's now been done. We now have a work plan, and we basically have 3 things which will sort of start up. I guess in some ways, this sort of launches that. But we will start up in January with internal speakers. Jim House, who I don't see here, is trying to get a graduate student colloquium going for May or June, and we have some student representatives, so we'll try and have that develop. And then we have some external speakers who are mainly brought in to try and help us scope out what is it that we mean by food systems. And that may seem like a bit of a pedantic question, but I think one thing we came to realize very early is when we brought people from these 4 different faculties together and talked about food systems, we had really divergent ideas on what that meant. So we're going to take some time and think about that. And hopefully by the time of our midterm review, or our 18-month review in 2019, we'll probably have a workshop and see if we can have made any progress on that. So the idea is there to bring in international speakers who have very well-established research programs on this area and see how that sort of fuels the conversation. Okay. Now, because of that, I thought I would dive a little bit into my own approach to food systems. And sort of to follow up on that idea that we're trying to explore different approaches to food systems. Okay, so a food system, in my perspective, is conceived at many scales from different perspectives. And I think if you think about that, and we had a short discussion, I think we would sort of very quickly find that some of us maybe share some ideas, but there are probably also some areas where we either work at different scales or we think quite differently about it. This conceptualization, if you like, that I'm going to present comes out of 4 years of work on a global project sort of convened by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature when I chaired an initiative called the People in Nature Initiative. And it was sort of a interdisciplinary that included Indigenous peoples representatives and sort of put out this volume in which this is included at the World Conservation Congress in 2016 in Hawaii. So to be sort of fair, this is a perspective that looks at sort of rural communities. It doesn't necessarily, some of the ideas may be used in an urban setting, but it really is sort of looking at food systems in rural remote communities. And what we sort of are interested in is sort of what is the composition of the food system, and then how what is produced or harvested circulates within a community and flows outside of a community along the way, creating distinct types of material and symbolic benefits. Let me take this opportunity to pause briefly because I'm not going to talk about this work, but Trust was involved in some of this work. And I almost put those slides in Trust, but then I didn't because it was just getting to be too much. And so we've had some partnerships in some of that work, and we had Trust involved. And one of her grad students, Victoria, who I think now is back in Malawi, right? So when we look at it, and if we sort of deal with the top bar for now, I think for us, a food system really has to go from that, what we would call appropriation, which is the conversion of something from the environment into something which is conceived of as a resource or a food by people. So it's that, and then it moves through different things like transformation exchange. It has mobility, it has to move within landscapes, it has flows, and final consumption. So usually when we think of a food system, we're trying to track that, trace that, and that's what we would see as a complete sort of system. Of course, within that, one can get into subsystems and scales, and you can sort of break it down. But conceptually, this for us is an important way that if we're talking about food systems, we have to be dealing with its production through to its consumption. And that a food system approach would eventually deal with that sort of full range of activities. So, since we come at this from sort of a landscape or a resource sort of approach, we start thinking about linking harvest or production to final consumption, and also those constituent elements. But we look at that from a biodiversity perspective, of course, this was done through the International Union for Conservation of Nature. For many of you, I guess, agrobiodiversity would be the closest sort of equivalent. But of course, in many of the areas we work, food systems are composed both of what people produce in their fields, their gardens, but also what they harvest from rivers, marshes, forests. So to actually have a full conceptualization of that food system, we have to account for that full range of things or places from which people harvest stuff. And this is actually some of the work that Trust contributed to, and we actually looked at the nutritional contribution in Costa Rica, the Bribri people from different wild species and things they produce within their fields. When we think about this, we think about it in terms of the sort of the biodiversity. Biodiversity, of course, we look at the species, habitat, landscapes. We think about flows, what makes flows possible and happen. That you can think about infrastructures. And then we think about different types of spaces. So how do we bound these systems? Territories, indigenous territories make sense. Sometimes it's watershed. Within that, we have these different things, forest fields. But also then you have different types of infrastructures like processing huts, or different things you need to transform something into a food and out of that thing you're harvesting from the environment. If you're interested, this document is available online, and you can search for that reference. Okay, so then going from there and from sort of trying to map out a food system, then the next sort of question that interests us is, well, so why or why not can people realize these benefits and how they're distributed amongst actors within the system? So of course now this is the interdisciplinary part of my work where we're trying to bring together the ecology with some of these social economic systems. And here we try and focus on things on the left-hand column. Some of these will be familiar to those of you who work in the food security area: availability, stability. Availability, really, you can think about as a stock. Stability, you can think about whether that thing is available over a season versus over a longer time period. So that sort of starts to get to the dynamics of the stock. When we work in sort of wild populations, then we start looking at, you know, the level of the population itself. Is sort of how we think about the availability. So if that population is diminishing, then of course it's not available to harvest, right? So I think those two are fairly straightforward. Where it starts to get a little more complex is when we start getting to access. So of course, this takes us a little more into the social realm. And in our framework, we draw upon existing theories to frame the analysis. And to say it sort of simply, and maybe reduce it too much, and drawing upon one of the examples from this work in Costa Rica. So as a producer of cacao, you may know how to produce a raw product, but you may not know how to turn it into chocolate, or you may not be able to access the markets to sell your cacao. So access isn't just physical access, it's access to the full things you need within that food system to realize that benefit. And I think this is what makes this analysis more, starts to include some of the social economic dimensions. And these in the bottom for access, I've just sort of outlined, these are some of the things that tend to get looked at when we're examining a food system. Now the bottom one is sort of perception. This is sort of a cultural lens, and of course this is how someone perceives that this thing can benefit them or not. So this is sort of, I guess, how we sort of approach some of the what often gets sort of lumped as culture, right? But which is sort of the idea of how someone perceives that thing as generating a benefit. Again, I'll use simple examples, although these are rooted in sort of ideas that, you know, if certain people perceive something as dirty, then that thing cannot become a food no matter how much we tell them that food is good for them. If they perceive it as poisonous, no matter how good the quality of that food is, until they're convinced otherwise, they will not consider that a food. So access to food, as sort of seen through this cultural lens, even in spite of the fact that the population may be there, it's a stable population, it's good to harvest, people have full access to it in terms of their physical access, they're not denied access through sort of fences or other types of means. that perception can actually also influence whether they take up and realize that benefit. So this is just sort of a way we try and sort of look at a food system through sort of an interdisciplinary lens. Okay, so I'm sure that's highly conceptual, and you probably have lots of questions. I sort of made a strategic choice here not to try and unpack those conceptual stuff too far and hope that some of that's intuitive, and then switch over to some examples, and hopefully that becomes a little bit clearer as we go. And almost at the halfway mark. We are at the halfway mark. Okay, so this is a case from one of my PhD students who helped develop this, now at the University de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, Julian Hidrobo. It's undertaken from Paraty, Brazil. This was a very systematic analysis of the food system using that framework we just talked about. Julian in your upper right, and some of the habitats from which people harvest things for their food system in this location. This just really starts to conceptually look at where are things coming from. So from the sea, they harvest 88 distinct species. You can see from the forest, secondary forest scrubland. Of course, within this, it's shifting agriculture. So agricultural fields and home gardens are carved out of those forests. And you have different types of things. You got fruits, you get games, you got tubers, spices. Firewood, of course, which is necessary for food systems. And then the coast. And so the point sort of makes, this is just sort of simply makes that point, the trace. So if you think of that map, and then conceptualizing that map and where things from the landscape and what they're contributing to the households. And then this just sort of makes the point, what he's done here is he's sort of looked at households as either being in kin groups of households, and they exchange things and things circulate within a community amongst households in different ways. So it's really just to try and conceptualize what does a food system look like in terms of how things harvested from the environment flow within the community, from the environment. Now, if we want to lay over that, some of those other issues of access, and I'm really only going to deal with one here. So the one that I'm going to draw your attention to is the sea and coast. So again, this is just trying to illustrate a whole pile of text. So we talked about infrastructure. So you can have a food system. You can have all these things swimming around in the ocean. You can have full rights to those things. But in fact, if you don't have a landing site for your boats, you can't benefit from those things. The people who have access to those landing sites can benefit. So it's important to understand these infrastructural components of a food system because they really start to get at who's benefiting, who's not, and how benefits then become distributed. Now, that happens within the community, and as it turns out, there are certain people who control those landing sites, certain people who don't, and actually become labor for those who control them. But the community as a whole then has different issues, and that is that so they have no land access, they have to go by boat. So the only place they can exchange, so the point in the infrastructure that facilitates exchange occurs at a dock that's within a now established gated community that didn't previously exist. Brings people in from Sao Paulo. It's the only place I've seen where actually you have helicopter pads, people arriving directly from Sao Paulo, landing down. Now, what's interesting about the dynamics here, if you think about this idea of stability, pelagic fish just happen to correspond to the time when people in Brazil take holidays. That creates the highest price for those fish. But of course, if you can afford to fly your helicopter to the place you're staying, and people are trying to truck fish through your community, you may not really want them going through your community. And so this sort of gets at those dynamics that you have a high price, and yet in spite of that, your ability to benefit from those fish is fully dependent on your ability to negotiate access and mobility through that gated community. And so that sort of tries to sort of illustrate a little bit these dynamics that conceptually seemed quite terse, perhaps. There's a publication on that one in Human Ecology. I think I had it on there. I don't know if you put these things on the web somewhere. Or, yeah, so I do have some of the publications these come from if you're more interested in the details. Okay, so now, trying to think how I'm going to shorten this. To switch to biocultural design. So if you think of the previous thing as a way we analyze food systems, and of course within that analysis we're interested how people realize and how benefits are distributed. Of course then the next question becomes, well, how do you support the new benefits or increasing those benefits or changing distributions? And so this really is more what we would call a practice. Well, the previous would be design research or research for design, however you want to call it that. There's different ways people sort of talk about that. This really is what we would think of as our practice and how we sort of work with communities. So this may or may not be a familiar term, biocultural design. I think one way it's used is express the mutually constituting relationship between biodiversity and society over time such that a distinct biocultural heritage emerges with distinct characteristics. For example, a species composition, landscape forms, soil patterns, agricultural varieties, livestock breeds, technologies, and technique, which of course is all of that which is needed to have food. So one can look at the biocultural heritage related to food and other sort of domains of biocultural heritage. In this case, we're sort of talking about food. Some of you may be more familiar with the idea of terroir, linked to wines, and this sort of expression of our territorial products, like unique food products like Parmesan, and this idea that these emerge from this combination of biophysical characteristics and cultural practice. So of course, all of these are constructed concepts. None of them are natural things. People construct them for very different purposes. And so biocultural heritage in that sense is also constructed. So it's not like these things sort of are real or you can sort of say that you can somehow sort of measure it, but they sort of become attached to those identities and people's identities. Now, because of this sort of link with the identity and the region, it also has become a means to try and establish competitive advantage for different types of products. So it's seen as a way, in terms of rural territorial development, as a way to stimulate or actually lead to a revitalization of rural economies in these types of small production systems. It's also now tied highly to tourism. All of you probably, or maybe many are familiar with different region in Canada. I'm trying to think if you've been to Prince Edward County. It's an amazing transition over the last 10 years. I grew up around that area. It was apple farmers and goat farmers and sheep farmers. We were not producing wines in that area. So it's really transitioned. So these things are starting to emerge in Canada. So, well, I'm going to sort of briefly talk a little bit about this slide. I'm going to sort of move on very quickly, examples, so don't panic. So our interest in terms of bioculture, so we're biocultural design. So it's the issue of biological materials. That's sort of key to design. And those biological materials are linked to territories, regions. But of course, when you're talking about the processing development of these products, these also bring in and link other territories and regions. So it's not as if everything you need is just within this one place. Culture sort of opens up this idea that things like language, knowledge are important, values are central, and this idea of creativity, that these things are not just things inherited from the past as complete wholes, but things that people are actually creatively constituting over time, which I think is an important thing. People often sort of look at communities in rural and remote areas, indigenous or otherwise, and say, well, they're sort of tradition bound. There's a great book we read back in my day in agriculture school. I'm trying to think, it was George Foster, called Modernization. And it was this book, and it was just it's a phenomenal book. And I wish I could find it again, because it was the most classic late 50s treatise on why people should modernize. So unlike George Foster, I would see people in these areas as being much more creative and dynamic than what they were given credit for, or have been given credit for in much of that type of modernization literature. I think it's important, the idea that also that, culture has important components to it that are sort of being talked about in terms of development, in that there's a whole package of instrumental knowledge, which for some of us who work in more natural resources field, this gets sort of put down as indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. So this piece of that knowledge is instrumental. People name things, they know how to use them, they know their material properties, they know all this stuff, right? But the other piece that's important within is that it's also values are valued. So culture contains values are valuative, and they sort of they influence what are acceptable pathways of development. So I think culture does more than that instrumental. It has that evaluative process. And the other piece that's left out and is important to this idea of dynamics is the idea of constitutive rights, right? People have the right to constitute their own culture over time and not to be assessed by others by certain characteristics in which people then say, well, you're no longer indigenous, right? And that's a package that sort of gets left out, where indigenous peasant communities are looked at as if they can sort of deliver some sort of good or outcome like conservation, and maybe or maybe not. Maybe they actually want to change and do other things. So I think sort of bringing those together makes it much more dynamic and allows us to sort of respect those basic set of rights. Now, this slide is actually very short text here. If you're interested in design or design thinking, this is not the talk for you, because I've already spent too much time on the food system part, and I purposely kept this sort of compact. However, for us, it provides a framing in which we can begin to develop a practice, support these enterprises. The initiatives are partner living in rural and remote regions. I think it's important to notice that while the focus is often on products, there's also the design of services which support product development or delivers a service that incorporates a product. And I'm going to give some examples of these, so hopefully that'll become clear. I think the only thing here that may not be sort of intuitive is this idea of correspondences. And this is really sort of contemporary sort of social science thinking. And that is that this idea of how do we consider relationships between people and environment. And I'm not going to delve into this in detail here. Suffice it to say that the idea of correspondence is how we think about how linkages are created between what an environment affords and what people perceive it to afford to create the lives they want to live. And that encapsulates a whole pile of literature. If you're more interested in unpacking some of this, if any of you from, which I doubt, from anthropology or those sort of disciplines, this really goes to the heart of the work of environmental ecological anthropology, a person called Timothy Ingold, and sort of this latest work with the ideas of Deleuze and Guattari around what's sort of how we think about contemporary social theory. Outside of that, I think all of this stuff I'll try and treat within the examples I give. And I'm going to skip this for today. I don't think it adds anything. Anyways, I need to find some time, and I think this is the easiest way to skip. What I do want to say, though, is design, because we're often dealing with what get called in the literature wicked problems or complex problems. What that means is that you have you have this idea of multiple possible solutions and intractable sort of problems that defy easy solutions. What this means from a design perspective is some of these problems we're dealing with, if we actually try and conceive the endpoint, we can't really conceive it when we start. So the question is, you have to start moving things forward along the way, but as you proceed, you may run up against, so to resolve this issue of viability and feasibility, you may actually have to choose a pathway that leads you contradicts your core values. So what is important in a design process is to identify those core values at the start of the process, and when these decision nodes are met, they're reevaluated for which way we want to go. I always think about this sort of simple one, having worked with Anishinaabe communities over a long time period, and this idea of people saying, well, you know, you could just make this medicinal plant, sell the thing. It's like, well, of course, they can't sell the thing. It really contradicts a core value for many Anishinaabe people. And so that then really is not a potential solution to that problem. And so that may be sort of where you end up. I think that's sort of a simple, or it's a dramatic example, if you like. But that's sort of where this idea of guiding coordinates comes from, because it's important that the outcome, or what we end up with as a design, doesn't contradict core values of the people for whom we're trying to work with to create more benefits. Okay, now moving on to the less conceptual. So take a deep breath. I'll have some water. This is going to be more pretty pictures than those type of conceptual diagrams. And I know I don't have any graphs, sorry. I don't know the last time I created a graph. Lots of illustrations, but maybe this is a little bit outside of the norm, but I think this will be at least interesting for you. In Hawaii, so design, of course, learns from cases. So one of the things you do is you document lots of cases. We want to learn about different composition, elements that go into compositions, different techniques, how those things come together, and you learn and then start thinking about those as you then approach your own processes. So this is an example then of learning from such a case. So in Hawaii, the case out of Wapa, it's been emerging over the last 10 years and spreading from community to community. This is an idealized representation of such a system that basically you can think of linking mountain peak to lagoons. Of course, because of the way they managed this landscape, it led to distinct sort of constituent elements in terms of species, biodiversity, and also land forms, which is sort of represented in this picture. It also, however, was a form of Hawaiian governance in that each watershed was managed by a family. And so, in fact, this term itself both integrates the idea of kinship, governance, and the way by which you produce things, or use the land, or interact with the land, relate to the land. So today, its revitalization then is linked to food security, language, governance, self-determination, and economic opportunities. So it sort of does a whole sort of different set of things. One of the first places, so before bringing this idea back was conceived, it was first put in place in, this is the north coast of Kauai. I'm going to pronounce that wrong. In a place, this is the National Tropical Botanical Garden, and it's called Limahuli. And it was basically put in place by a Hawaiian Kawiki Winter who studied at the University of Hawaii, went to work for the Botanic Garden, and then wanted to start reestablishing this system. And so here what we see is the upper two components of the system. We see the upper part of the watershed with the mountains and the forest. And of course we see the taro ponds that both create food but also slow down the movement of water through this watershed, which is sort of some of the functions, if you like, of what it's doing. This then led to, so I think it's important because this now provides sort of an example of what could be sort of re-envisioned. And then it started to be taken up in different contexts. But of course, one of the problems is how do you pay for its establishment? And there's certain costs to getting these things going, rebuilding the taro ponds and that. So this is another example also from Kauai of taro fields. And the point I want to make here is they reestablished this by making agreements with the national government, or the government, for a national wildlife refuge. Because in fact, as it turns out, these taro ponds actually are critical habitats for water birds in Hawaii. So they sort of found a way to get that established. And from there, it sort of has moved into more community initiatives. Some of these also linked to conservation. This is on Big Island. This is sort of reestablishing another lagoon system. You can see the basic gates here that allows the water in. This is sort of the inner lagoon where you eventually sort of harvest the fish. That's just beautiful, but that's part of it. And right now the gates aren't reestablished, and so it's one of the best places to see sea turtles. However, of course, the sea turtles eat the fish, so what you eventually do is want to exclude the sea turtles. However, for now, it's really a pretty place to go see sea turtle. It was literally a turtle a minute was going through these gates. It's phenomenal. Now, I think while we often focus on the material benefits of food system, what this project sort of emphasized for me was the subjective components of reestablishing these systems for Hawaiian identity and self-determination, and the involvement of youth and children in a process of identity formation. So I think when we think about food systems, we may want to focus on functional outcomes and the foods, but of course there's all these subjective things going on that are equally important. So equally important for us to consider in a biocultural design process. And I think also the relational part of doing this in relation and reestablishing relations. Now, of course, I haven't used the term well-being. I didn't want to have to yet define another term, but those of you who are familiar with that concept, of course, well-being focuses on material, subjective, relational, right? That's what well-being means from a sort of more technical point of view, I guess. And of course, these food systems thus are contributing to Hawaiian well-being and those different those different things that aren't just material. So this this one I want to move to. So this is another one, the same system. This, of course, is on Wahoo, and it looks and builds upon the bioculture heritage of the past. And if you look at this picture taken in the early part of the 20th century, you can see the lagoon, you can see the fields, and you can also see the mountains. So here you have an intact system at some point in the early 20th century. When we look at that today, you see it's quite a peaceful sort of look. However, if you turn the other way, so if you're looking this way, that's what you see. If you're looking that way, what you see are the bombers, or whatever those transport planes are, because this across the bay is the Central Pacific Command for the US Marines. And those planes are going all the time. So in spite of this complex context now of which they're living and trying to rebuild these things, they've rebuilt the lagoon, they've rebuilt the structures to let the fish in and out. They have working gates. They've reestablished the taro fields, although they've added new components like sheep to graze the margins. And the uplands are being used for a cultural center, medicinal plant harvesting, youth camps, and different types of activities or ceremonial activities. And all of those things from those different nodes are brought together in this kitchen, which basically runs a food program in a Native Hawaiian community. They cater events, weddings, whatever they can do, and youth are taught how to prepare these foods. So the sort of point I'm trying to make here is we sometimes think of these local food systems as things that exist in these far away and far distant places. But in actual fact, this is what, so if you think of that air photo, this is what that now looks like. So these are being built in these sort of modern complex landscapes that have evolved since that time, 20th century. And I think it's an example of how local food systems or small scale food systems really can become nodes of activities or production and consumption. So again, going back to our idea from production and consumption, they're not always intact units, sort of like my spatial diagram showed. They often become the nodes of activity. And in this case, these are all distinct organizations doing these different nodes, and they're brought together in a grassroots network. So I think when we talk small scale, or we talk local, I think sometimes we need to at least start shifting our focus to how these different networks are being reconstructed, reconstituted. And for Native Hawaiians, they can't get tenure back to all that land and that whole place. So they are doing what they can bit by bit, piecing it together, again, from mountain to reef, so they have fish up to the medicinal plants, and they're doing it through these nodes and networks. And so I think that's a different way to think about local food systems. couple final points then. That's sort of the analysis part. Then we also have some projects where we're actually working both to analyze the food system. Mariana's here. I didn't know she'd be here, but there she is. This is her project. She's working on cacao agroforestry systems, but also then in biocultural design in terms of new cacao products. Talk to her if you have any more questions. Maria's here, who's working on mezcal. This is just beginning. She still has yet to defend her proposal, but we've been to this site. You may or may not know mezcal has now become a huge issue. It's what some people might call a territorial product with global demand and global circulation. It's leading to changes in the landscapes as new mezcals are planted, new agaves planted to produce mezcal, and to the growth of stills in these communities. In this case, these are Zapotec communities. So in both these cases, cacao and agave, you have local biological materials that have become desired for, in the one case, fine chocolate, Mariana's case for Brie cacao, which is one of the places where the historic origins of cacao is sort of seen. In the other case for mezcal, again, this is a traditional place. This is a place that traditionally produced mezcal at a sort of a home scale, if you like, or community scale. And in these cases, then, the challenge becomes, how do you, so in these projects, when we're working about biocultural design, it's how do people actually realize these benefits and sort of ensure they get a fair share as they try and access these value chains. So in neither of these cases are the Zapotec or the Brie saying they don't want to link into these value chains, but what they're trying to negotiate is how they do it in a way that actually creates the type of benefits they want to create out of that new market. And so that's a different set of challenges. I'm going to skip one case, which is sort of unfortunate. It's the Canada case of Menomin. And just because I want to get to the last sort of prairie topic, let me just sort of go, sorry about this, I got a little bit off script. The only thing I want to say about where we've gotten to in this case, we reestablished, working with Wabsamang First Nation, Menomin's another really important thing, but of course at the time we started this project, it wasn't being harvested in the community, and Marvin McDonald, who's our partner, was very concerned about this, and it was only consumed at events. And when we ran the first harvest camp, all of it was sold outside of the community, and this led to this idea of how can we increase its benefits locally, so we started this participatory design workshop for using blueberries and Menomin to produce granola and recipe bars for use in the school food program. A local market, sort of a low entry, easy way to start getting things going. And we worked with Food Science Group. There's Martin, some of his students. And these are sort of the workshops, which, by the way, is one of the best, this idea of, this comes out of an Anishinaabe idea, this learning while working together. This is the best way to do research, I find. It's just, people are much more engaged. When we talk about these things, people are in workshops, they're like, oh, okay, nutritional benefit, right? But when you actually make things, people are very engaged. People are very engaged from the community and the cooks. Okay, so here's where I was going to finish. And I wanted to finish here, because this is the most, the new part of what we're doing. And this sort of came out, and I also wanted to finish here, because this came a little bit of a challenge from some of the early discussions within the Food System Research Group. And it was, well, why don't you work in, first of all, I only work at a few places in Northwestern Ontario with Anishinaabe communities right now. And they sort of, well, why don't you work in Manitoba in the prairies? And I said, well, because I haven't worked in agricultural systems since 1988, so I really don't know what I'm doing. So that's truth. It's also because when you work in some of these things I showed you, the biocultural aspect and heritage aspect is really sort of clear. I think it's sort of present. It's easy to think about how they can develop both sort of local sort of benefits and sort of engage in different types of selling products. And so it's just sort of clear. And then you come to the prairies and you say, okay, well, what is the biological heritage of prairies? Does that concept even make any sense? And it's a tough one. And that's sort of, I think, what we've been struggling with. And so as we tried our sort of entry into this, what we sort of started with was this report produced by the Smal Scale Working Group, which is in Manitoba. And they had this definition for what is small scale. And in a good sort of design approach where you start with divergent thinking, we thought, let's not over-define this. Let's just find out what people are doing. And then see whether we can figure out if there's anything we can work on. So that's where we started. We then did two very simple things for us. We basically did a scan, farmers markets, small specialty stores, just to see what products are showing up in these places. And we interviewed some people, again, very low cost, 10 people, just to get a sense of what they knew about this, what's going on in this area. A couple interesting things came out about this. The diversity is phenomenal, which also makes it incredibly complex from my point of view. And the consensus that it's growing. I should say we also did this in Saskatoon with a colleague at the University of Saskatchewan. So in both places that people are, yeah, there's more interest, there's more stuff showing up, people are getting engaged. And so then we sort of went on to this idea of enabling factors and hindering factors. I think some of this is fairly intuitive, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these. There's only a couple things I wanted to point out. Manitoba actually created that small scale working group, produced that report, and then put in 2 Manitoba government employees that sort of support that sector. Saskatoon and Saskatchewan's done nothing. So in fact, when you talk about service providers, it shows up both as enabling and hindering, because in Saskatchewan, the government, they feel, is doing very little. Whereas here, people think there's a start, maybe not enough, but something's at least happening. Financing, again, shows up on both, because government financing has improved in Manitoba. There's actually funding envelopes you can access. But of course, banks are still hesitant to give loans to small producers. Another sort of interesting things that came out of this is the idea that sharing space on the enabling and competition on the hindering. So people are sort of willing to share resources, share certain types of spaces. But on the other hand, when you have so many people producing vegetables, there's only so much market, and so then there's high competition. This idea of marketing is an interesting one for me, because a lot of people talk about this issue of marketing. What is your small scale producer? What they're sort of talking about is, well, we have to have all these skills. You know, branding right through to soil management. And it's tough, right? And then, so, you know, it's like, hey, you got to know a lot of stuff, and maybe there's a couple running it. And yet you have to be good in all this stuff. And that's a little bit different, say, than if you're producing carrots and selling at the peak of the market and they're dealing with all that consumption side. So I think this is sort of something that sort of came out that's definitely it seems to be a big challenge. And that came out both in Saskatchewan and here. So I want to finish just by saying a couple things. So there are a lot of innovations. So I think even though they're small scale, because they're small scale and because it's not well established, they're trying lots of different stuff. So lots going on there. What interests me, remember, I'm trying to sort all this out and say, okay, what might be something worth thinking about? Not that these are the only things we're thinking about, but what fits sort of how we work. A couple things came up. Community kitchens, identity-preserved products, and this idea of food hubs and aggregators. I like these because they both are opportunities and they have certain potential challenges. Manitoba invested in community kitchens. There's an example of a processor who used the community kitchens. And this really gets at the issue that capital costs. So when you move from producing in your kitchen and your stovetop and you scale up, but you're not yet at the scale that you can afford or get the bank to lend you money to produce a plant, or you're not willing to go there, then being able to access the right equipment in this sort of space is really important. This is going on more in Toronto, more in Ottawa, more in Montreal, where they're creating what sort of comes out of this makerspace movement, where they are actually, you make certain types of equipment available so people can actually innovate in this way and it reduces the cost of entry to the sector. So that's an interesting one. Don't know how well it's done, so we just sort of came up and we just sort of want to explore it more. Identity preserved products, this is an interesting one. Let me just sort of poke the bear on this one a little bit. I think it's an easy concept to understand. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. Think of kosher food, think of halal food. There's certain values that are carried through from source to final consumer, organic, sustainability. So that's sort of, it's preserved through the value chain. One thing I would like to look at, I think is interesting, is this idea of craft breweries. So you can be local food in your processing, but you may not actually then purchase and source your ingredients from those producers who share similar values. And so that is not identity preserved from final product through to production, or consumption through to production. So that's an interesting dynamic, I think, that we'd like to explore a little more. And this idea of food hubs aggregators, I think this one may go against some of the direct marketing stuff, but seems to be very clear that cost of distribution are a problem. So if you think about a person producing some vegetables and they're selling a kilo to 10 different restaurants, 10 different specialty stores, and then they're doing every Saturday at the farmer's market, huge amount of cost into that aspect. And so what started to emerge in the US is some of these food hubs, where you try and then keep those values, but you try and reduce the cost of distribution. I don't know if that would go with direct market people, but that's why I think it's interesting to explore as a researcher. So to conclude and speculating, is there the possibility of prairie biocultural products or territorial products? Not sure yet. I think the question then comes out to, you have these distinct identities. You have Aboriginal and settler. They're going to be distinct types of identities. And then can these products link back to those identities to create sort of competitive advantage or market segregation? And this idea of local foods or small scale, is it actually carried through that chain? And that's where we sort of arrived at in our very early entry into thinking about this in a prairie food system context. Thank you for your attention. I know I went a bit long and I used every bit of my 50 minutes. So that's great. I felt like, you know, there's this little joke that I'd sort of be interviewing elders and they'd sort of be there and they'd be talking and they'd finally look at their watch and they'd say, all right, I think I've told you enough for me to have lunch. Thank you.
So, questions for Iain? Yeah.
It was very nice and interesting talk, Iain. I really enjoyed your biocultural design concept. But from my experience, you talked about a little bit of modernization and also the cultural impactness, the value and relational aspect of biocultural design. From my social well-being framework perspective, I see it as a kind of challenge because when you talk about modernization and value and relational aspect, from my past experience, they don't really go hand in hand together in certain places, maybe some other places. So when the market enters and then competitive advantages come, people less care about values and intactness relations, they more care about the material aspect of their life. Mm-hmm. And that's how the relational aspects changes, the dynamics between the producers, the consumers. So do you see globalization or modernization as a threat to biocultural design in the later on the future?
Well, not to biocultural design per se. I guess, does it have the potential to lead to internal changes within communities and landscapes? Obviously, yes. And after Maria does her work, we're going to find out how something like the rapid emergence of a global market traces back into institutions and landscapes within Indigenous communities who are trying to navigate that relationship. But yeah, obviously, now, I mean, in terms of biocultural design, I would say the sort of goal, well, and I think this is sort of, it's the dilemma, right? of when we work with communities with very strong sort of identity formation, of the individual versus the community, and how those two things create and lead to tensions internally. And that's just part of the process. Some communities navigate it, some communities are overwhelmed by it. But when some communities choose to really use a collective approach, and some communities allow more individual enterprises. In fact, we've picked through our work in Oaxaca, it's sort of what we've found is one community in which the stills are owned, they seem to be, we're still trying to figure out, by individuals or families, and in the other, they're trying to establish a collective enterprise, community enterprise, to produce mezcal. But yeah, that's a tension that's always been present for sure. It's a tough one.
You mentioned in your discussion or explanation about biocultural design, you mentioned terroir. I guess as you were explaining what biocultural design is all about, I kept thinking, well, that sounds a lot like terroir. So can you explain what distinguishes biocultural design from terroir? Or what does biocultural design add to this idea of terroir?
Terroir is incredibly French. I'm not sure. Okay, so I think there's a big discussion in literature about terroir, right? And it's obviously, does it really, to me, the issue, whether you call it terroir or biocultural heritage, goes back to its social construction in that place. And so terroir is the construction in a very French sense of things that bring together biophysical characteristics, what I tried to say, the biophysical characteristics with cultural practice and technique that leads to certain types of products, right? And so in Italy, you might think, you don't think of terroir in relation to cheese, but you do think of territory. Yet they're looking at very similar things, that you have different technique, you have the certain caves that leads to certain, help me out, food science. Microorganisms, thank you, drew a blank. And of course that leads to that distinct cheese, which then becomes that identity, which then allows them to claim this cheese is different than that cheese. Deal with the cows and the grass they're eating, all that stuff, right? And so I don't know that I would say, so then if you sort of say, well, what's biocultural design? So then it's trying to sort of look at that issue and support the emergence of those type of opportunities for communities that have similar, ability to to utilize those local characteristics. And so that's how it's emerged in territorial design, this idea of rural territorial design with identity, which is sort of this big NGO, RIMISP, the Latin American NGO. So that's sort of what they've started to look at. And my interests are, because I've worked at this a lot in the indigenous context in the Americas, as territorial claims are made and established, and then communities are saying, well, how, gaining the rights to this territory, how do we now change the material conditions of our people? And that's one of their distinct advantages, because when they enter markets around sort of straight out competition, if they can't segregate and distinguish what they're doing, it's very hard to compete, which is the same reason they do it in Europe. It's hard to compete with mass production, right? So it tries to create a price advantage, which may be, that's not why people fought for those rights, but now if you want to create those products, that's one thing one could look at. And so I don't see a huge difference between, I think so terroir doesn't get taken up. The other thing I guess I left out there was, like biocultural heritage, one of the reasons we stuck to it, I don't particularly, I'm on the fence on biocultural, right? We used it because it's linked and tied into lots of UNESCO policy and a lot of international policy, and it's starting to show up in the Convention on Biological Diversity and lots of other places. So it has lots of resonance globally. It has less resonance in Canada, there's no doubt. And that's one of the things we're trying to figure out when you bring the ideas to Canada. Well, how do you tweak it and maybe, and even territory, even though that makes sense in Europe and Latin America, it's region as close as we get in Canada. Like maybe regional products. We don't really think of territorial products like they do in Europe. So I think that's a big discussion, it's an important discussion, how we conceptualize that advantage in the Canadian context. And we're not there yet. We're just trying to figure it out.
Any further questions for Iain? Okay, well, thank you, Iain.
Found
Thanks
it.
very much.
Thank you.